Okay, so let's get started. Welcome again to this first session out of two that we are running in regards of good regulatory practices and its implementation for the medical technology sector. I will start by sharing some housekeeping messages. This session, as everything that we do under the MDRC project, is being recorded, so we may upload it and have it available for all relevant stakeholders and interested persons to have access to all these wealth of information that is going to be shared today. And you will be able to access to the recording at the MDRC website. As we usually do, we are having simultaneous interpretation available both to French and Portuguese. If you go down in your screens at the Zoom platform tool, you will find the globe icon where you can select the language that you could prefer to be listening to the session. Microphones of all participants are closed in order to prevent background noise and be able to have a clear recording. And as we always want this to be as fruitful as possible of a learning experience, we kindly propose for you to post your questions also using the Zoom platform Q&A feature that is also located at the bottom of your screens. So with that, your questions are going to be voiced to the speakers or panelists through the moderator of each of the sessions. And for the speakers, we really appreciate, if possible, for you to turn on your cameras during your presentations. May we ease the work and make a better, a more accurate interpretation of the messages that are being shared. And of course, not only the recordings are going to be available in our website, but also the decks that our speakers are going to be sharing with us today. So without further ado, welcome again. Thank you very much for all the speakers and panelists that are sharing their expertise today with us. And we really invite you to try to make this as interactive as possible. So with this, then we're going to get started. This is the agenda that we're going to be covering today, and we will start with the support of Renee Hanker, who is the Director for Regulatory Policies at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, with an introduction and overview on good regulatory practices. And then we will have a presentation by the World Trade Organization by Anastasia Kultunova on international benchmarks for medical device regulatory frameworks and authorities in regards of trade and legal references and obligations. And then to close this session, we will have an African regional trade and GRP conversational with a conversational focus, where we will have Tobias Ololo, who is manager for standards at the Kenya Bureau of Standards and EAC COMESA. And Renee will also join us in this conversation that is going to be moderated by Stephen Bipes. So again, without further ado, let's get started and let's take the best out of these great speakers that are joining us today. So Renee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to see such great participation today. It's very early in Washington, but I've had my coffee, so I think I'm ready to go. And if Sandra will share the slides, I'm going to cover at a very high level as sort of an introduction to good regulatory practices, as well as a little bit about the agreement on technical barriers to trade, because there is definitely a connection between the two, and I think that's going to be helpful. Often we have experts who are in the TBT space and the GRP space separately, but there's definitely connectivity there, and hopefully I'll help you to see that a little bit through this presentation. And so I'm just going to help me advance the slides. So next slide. So just to start off with, I think we just need to understand what good regulatory practices are. So when we refer to good regulatory practices, or GRPs, as they're mostly abbreviated, we're talking about practices that improve the quality and consistency of the domestic rulemaking process. So I like to call these the rules for rulemaking, right? So it's the very high level, the philosophy of a government with respect to how regulation is supposed to happen. And so that is something that needs to be put into practice, right? So there are various ways that these practices can be implemented. You can have overarching laws that guide regulatory policy. You can have acts or decrees, depending on the country. You can also have, it's also important to have different mechanisms, right, to ensure that these practices are applied uniformly across government. I think that's important to remember. We're not talking about the practices of a particular agency. It's supposed to be the way that the regulations are prepared, developed, and implemented across the whole of government. And so that way, you know, there's consistency and uniformity with respect to how these activities are implemented. And so there are, you know, good regulatory practices. Some of the basics are, you know, fundamentally it's about transparency, making sure that that the processes are clear and understandable, that the information is available to interested persons, you know, citizens, but also those beyond a country's borders. It's also important to have these policies and practices grounded in sound evidence and data and other information. Good regulatory practices are supposed to provide better regulatory outcomes. So, you know, if we're going to talk a little bit more about what some of these good regulatory practices are, but ideally, if they're implemented, you're going to get a better regulation at the end of the process. We can go on to the next slide. So there's a couple of things to remember about good regulatory practices. It's not, the idea is not that we're focused on more regulation, less regulation. We're talking about better regulation, right? And another important thing to remember is that these practices are supposed to apply regardless of the type of regulation, right? So there's a fundamental rules that every regulator uses. So you should not differentiate between regulation of goods, regulation of services. For the most part, these rules cover virtually everything that a central government will be doing. I'm focused on central government, but I'd emphasize too that the trend, you know, it's important that these practices be followed at every level, so subcentral, local as well. Mostly in my role, I'm focused on central government, but I know that a lot of countries are working to ensure that these practices are implemented, you know, top to bottom at all levels of government. The second thing is to remember that while the policies, while the leadership may change, while the focus and the priorities of those who are running, you know, your political leadership may change, the good regulatory practices are going to stay the same. You're going to follow those regardless of what the policy is, right? And what that does is it provides predictability and consistency. It also helps build confidence, right, in a government, regardless, because you're following the same rules. People know how to engage with the government. They know where to find information. All that's really important. The third thing is that good regulatory practices are sort of the base on which to build regulatory cooperation. You can't really have successful regulatory cooperation without GRPs being used, right? So regulatory cooperation It's primarily something that's focused, it's a sector-to-sector regulator engagement that has some kind of tangible outcome. They're connecting because they want to achieve a particular resource efficiency, or they want to address a certain problem, whatever. But you need those basic good regulatory practices for that to work. You need to understand what information that regulators are bringing to the table. You need to understand their practices, how they're going to implement the regulatory change that they're working on. So the next slide, please. So as I've noted, GRPs are relevant to all regulations with very few exceptions. Some exceptions are sort of like national security interests, some foreign affairs activities, or practices like internal to an agency, how it sets up its procedures. But for the most part, it's about all regulations. I'd also emphasize, while we're talking about TBT, good regulatory practices do not just apply to technical regulations, or they also don't apply just to the regulation of goods, as I've noted. It's supposed to be all regulation. And not only that, but these good regulatory practices cover the entire regulatory life cycle. So this circle, this cycle here that you see, I mean, you apply the GRPs when a regulator is first trying to identify a problem, an issue that needs to be addressed, that can be solved through regulation. The good practices, in terms of using high quality information and evidence and data, help them as they gather information. They consult with the public and interested stakeholders to get input and before they start to design their regulation. Then the GRPs are also relevant with respect to the implementation of the regulation as it's published for draft, taking comments, taking those comments into account, the development of a regulatory impact assessment, final publication of a measure, and then even the GRPs apply when the regulation's done. You're supposed to do ex post evaluation of whether the regulation achieved the objective it set out to achieve. So it's not just at one particular stage. The draft stage is very important, right? That is where you're going to need to do the most work, but the GRPs apply throughout the whole regulatory life cycle. Next slide. So what are some good regulatory practices? Here I've listed out about 12 good regulatory practices that are pretty common. The first, number one, is having a regulatory register. That's something, publishing information about regulations that the government plans to develop or implement within a certain period of time in the foreseeable future. That provides information to interested persons so that they can start to plan, also so they can connect with the government to say, hey, I don't think we really need to regulate in this area, or do you have this information as you're making this, as you're working to develop your regulation? So regulatory register. The second one, public consultation, very important, providing opportunity for public comment as regulations are being developed. We like to say that regulators don't have all the information, and so they need to cast a wide net in terms of consulting and seeking information as they're beginning to develop a regulation. Also important to publish the evidence and the analysis that justifies the proposed action that's being taken. This is another way to get input, to check whether the facts are accurate, whether the impact expected has been assessed accurately, that you've thought about the potential impact on some stakeholders that you might not have taken into account as you were developing the regulation. It's also important not only to get the comments, but to look at the comments and address those comments and see how they might better inform the the decision-making process. Some other examples, use of quality data and sound science, and using risk-based approaches and conducting regulatory impact assessments where appropriate. Countries do this differently, but really fundamentally, we're talking about really doing the ex ante, the early upfront analysis before a regulation is put into effect, because we all know that it's very difficult to change a regulation once it's finalized. It's much easier to adapt and incorporate new information in the development process. Something that's become a more recent topic of conversation is assessing the international impact of regulation, right? Because we know that there are lots of issues, policy issues that we are facing today that cross borders. And so there needs to be better coordination across governments, but there also needs to be, the regulators need to think about who's going to be affected, because the impacted persons may not necessarily be within the boundaries of your country. They could be across on the other side of the globe. Number 10 is using international standards as a basis for regulations. So that, again, is really important to make sure that regulations are aligned across borders, but also it's an acknowledgement there's a whole mechanism out there. We'll talk a little bit more about technical regulations and standards, but there's thousands of organizations, of bodies that are developing standards through a consensus open process and using the appropriate technical experts. And so we need to draw on that expertise instead of reinventing standards for our specific national purposes. And then, as I mentioned before, 11, conduct ex post assessments of regulation, look at whether it worked or not and what maybe modify if necessary. And then finally, another GRP is having central coordinating body or mechanism. And this is to help to ensure that all these good regulatory practices are uniformly implemented. Next slide. So as I've noted, good regulatory practices are a critical tool that help governments achieve their policy objectives in an effective manner. We know that there's been some research, certainly in recent years, showing that these regulatory divergences are very costly. And so making sure that we apply the practices as in the regulatory process can help to make sure that we also are developing regulations that make the most sense, that have the minimal impact on traders, and maximize net benefits to society. So next slide. I wanted to mention that good regulatory practices are not something that only one country is advocating or something that's sort of just a recent activity. I am working primarily on good regulatory practices in the trade space, but the work on good regulatory practices has been going on for some time. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has a number of guidelines and recommendations relating to regulatory policy that have been evolving over the last decade or so. Really, the seminal work is the 2012 recommendation on regulatory policy and governance that kind of sets out the high-level principles and tools that policymakers can use to develop and implement regulations. I think there's like about a dozen of these that are identified, and they're going to sound familiar if we just looked at the list of GRPs, but the 2012 recommendation talks about things like committing at the political level to a whole of government policy for regulatory quality, adhering to principles of open government, transparency, and participation in the regulatory process, establishing mechanisms and institutions to provide oversight of regulatory policy, integrating regulatory analysis into the rulemaking process, systematically reviewing regulations, those kinds of elements are identified in the 2012 recommendation. So you can see there's some consistency in terms of what everyone thinks GRPs are. More recently, the OECD has focused on recommendations for international regulatory cooperation and agile regulatory governance. These were both just finalized last year. The reg cooperation recommendation is emphasizing the value of governments working together through regulation to address global challenges. And then the agile regulatory governance recommendation is emphasizing the importance of regulatory flexibility and regulatory adaptability. In addition to the OECD, I'd note that the other major work stream for GRPs has been in the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum that's emphasized transparency and good regulatory practices since its inception in 1995. But there's been a lot of work that's been done, including the 2000 APEC OECD regulatory checklist. That's one of the other reference documents that the GRP nerds all look to. Next slide. So I am responsible for negotiating good regulatory practices in our trade agreements, and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, we call it the USMCA, has the first ever good regulatory practices chapter in one of our trade agreements. And this slide shows you the articles of the GRP chapter. They're going to look familiar because it's pretty much tracked with the list that I showed you of what core GRPs are considered. So the United States has worked to implement what the OECD and APEC and others have introduced and identified as good regulatory practices into our good regulatory practices chapter in our USMCA. We've negotiated other agreements in recent years with Brazil and Ecuador. We're negotiating now with other countries like Taiwan and in the Indo-Pacific. And we continue to believe that it's important that all of these good regulatory practices are fundamental to helping us to ensure good governance, but also to facilitate trade and investment. We're going to talk about TBTs in a moment, but regulatory issues are a major trade irritant, and so by using GRPs, we can help to reduce those regulatory concerns and help to facilitate trade. And so that's why we include the good regulatory practices in USTR's trade work. We think that it's absolutely a win-win because good regulatory practices help the country. It helps the country to improve its economic development and to attract investment, but it also helps to ease those barriers in terms of trade between countries. And so that work is ongoing. Next slide. I don't know if we want to stop for questions here or if you want me to just go on to the TBT slide.
Renee, as I don't see any question posted yet, probably we can get going and then we consolidate all the questions for the end, if it is okay with you.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're just going to talk briefly about the technical barriers to trade agreement as a good regulatory practice. So next slide. And I have a call. Our WTO colleague will go into WTO a bit more, but really the WTO sets the rules for trade. It's the only international organization dealing with trade between nations, and with currently 164 members. These are the WTO agreements, of which there are a number. TBT is one. There's also the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, and other plurilateral agreements provide the ground rules for international commerce and help as we said, to try to facilitate trade and get rid of those obstacles that hinder trade. Next slide. I mentioned just a moment ago that regulatory barriers are a common trade irritant. And what we've seen is that over the years, as tariffs have declined, that these non-tariff barriers have started to increase. And so again, the GRPs, but also the TBT agreement and its provisions, its obligations for members help to address those non-tariff barriers. Next slide. So the TBT agreement, it encourages members to use less trade restrictive approaches to meet regulatory objectives. It encourages greater harmonization and alignment of regulatory requirements through the use of relevant international standards. It absolutely promotes transparency through the use of notification of draft technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures, and helps to, through the work of the TBT committee, provides opportunities for nations to work together to resolve issues relating to standards and conformity. Next slide. So the technical barriers to trade agreement is really very helpful in terms of ensuring that the technical requirements do not become disguised barriers to trade. It is through the mechanisms of the TBT agreement, there's opportunities for members to comment on the technical regulations of other members, again, to work together, to share information that regulators can use to essentially modify the draft measure. It allows stakeholders to know what these draft measures are so they can comment on them, and also help the regulators to identify issues with these technical requirements. The TBT agreement also, through these mechanisms, we're also helping to avoid inefficient or ineffective technical requirements and procedures that don't make sense or maybe are duplicative or redundant. Again, by relying on what's been done, using other standards, it helps to facilitate trade. Next slide. Here I'll just identify, I'm sure I've mentioned these a little bit already, and my colleague will probably go into these a little bit more, but the main principles of the agreement are non-discrimination, avoiding barriers that are more trade restrictive than necessary, encouraging the use of international standards, guides, and recommendations, notifying draft measures, providing an inquiry point where a focal point to receive information and comments from other members, and also focused on conformity assessment procedures to help facilitate use of international systems of conformity assessment, mutual recognition. The committee's done a great deal of work in terms of identifying potential conformity assessment procedures and actions that can help to facilitate trade. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one. I think probably my colleague's going to go into this in more detail. I did want, we want to emphasize the decisions and recommendations of the committee. And one of the great things about the TBT agreement is that it's constant. The members are constantly evaluating and improving and thinking about how to apply the principles of the agreement in new and different ways, right? So one of the major recommendations that came out from the committee through its triennial review process in 2000 was the decision on the principles for development of international standards. And so that is indicating doesn't identify specific standards that any particular member should use. Rather, the decision emphasizes the process that's used to develop the standards. So an open process that's transparent, that is balanced, excuse me. All of these things help to, get more, better standards. Just like we've been talking about better regulations, these principles help us to produce better standards that can be used by members. And the agreement does, members are supposed to use international standards where they're relevant and applicable to their situation, or where they're under development and will soon be finalized. They should look and use those international standards rather than creating unique standards. Next slide. Also, I wanted to mention, it's really important, this is kind of connecting standards and regulation, but regulatory authorities should be relying on voluntary consensus standards developed through those processes that I just mentioned in terms of the TBT committee decision. As I said, those resources are there. The technical experts are developing them. It's important to use those standards wherever possible, and to avoid the creation of unique government standards. Again, it saves the regulator work. The technical experts have already done the work on the specific standard in a particular area. It also, in terms of these experts are constantly taking on new information. The standards are updated on a regular basis, so you're encouraging innovation, and it's supporting compliance with the WTO obligation. Next slide. So we're trying to connect TBT and good regulatory practices a little bit here. So I've kind of mentioned that these regulatory divergences impose costs and cause and help and hinder business, right, in trade and moving products between markets. I think we've realized with the pandemic that it's really important that supply chains are global, and so the more that these regulatory requirements are aligned, it can also help to get products moving as quickly as possible. Certainly, we're not questioning government needs to regulate for health, safety, and environment, but in many cases, this work can help to facilitate trade and keep the supply chains moving. The agreement also provides a platform for engagement among governments in terms of understanding what the processes are. A lot of times, if you are a participant in the TBT committee, you know that a member will ask, why wasn't this notified with adequate time for comment? The TBT agreement says you should provide 60 days for public comment. If a measure is, finalized without that comment period, members will raise the issue on the floor of the TBT committee. There's opportunities to identify other standards that a member may have used that could be considered in addition to the standard that was identified in a specific technical regulation. There's all these opportunities for consultation and engagement. And the disciplines of the agreement help contribute with the effectiveness and the efficiency of regulations. Lays down the specific legal disciplines which directly address the preparation, adoption, and application of domestic regulation on goods. One difference between the broad GRPs and TBT is TBT is talking only about goods. GRP more broadly, as I've noted, is about all regulation. And I think that's it. I think that might be the last slide, but next slide. think that might be the end of the presentation, but I think there's a couple of slides on EPing. Okay, I forgot this one. I mean, we'll be talking about this a little bit more, but I just did want to mention that the TBT committee, I mean, issues are sector focused. Regulations address specific sectors, and certainly the medical technology sector is one of the most regulated sectors, right? So a lot of the discussions that are in the specific trade concerns that are raised in the TBT committee are dealing with medical technologies, chemicals, autos. Those are some other examples. But so there's these issues can be addressed through the TBT committee. A lot of the work does focus on medical technology. There's also thematic sessions where we've been able to focus a bit more on the challenges faced by the medical technology sector. And I think we'll be hearing a little bit more about that in a few moments. So I think I'll stop so we can go on with the program, but happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Just noting, Renee, that Sandra's connection was lost, but she's gonna reconnect. And maybe it would be helpful if you could, Leticia's gonna put the deck up. If you could just step through briefly, EPing, just mention it briefly and how that pertains. It's a TBT discipline, but it's also very helpful in the context of being a global public consultation mechanism.
Right. I mean, EPing is a great transparency tool. The EPing platform was launched last year. It is open and accessible to everyone. You can look at the information without being registered, but if you register, you get all the information. You can customize the information so you can find out about the regulations in a particular market or in a particular sector. The United States is actually, we had our own notification system, but we've switched over to EPing, as has the European Union. EPing, I mean, it's an amazing resource to, as Stephen said, to learn about what the proposed measures are in a particular WTO member, and through your TBT inquiry point, interested stakeholders can provide their input on these draft measures. It's got lots of functionality. You can sort it, by country, or you can sort it by specific aspect of the agreement. So there's we're just finding it's a wealth of information, but for everyone, right? I encourage everyone, if you haven't looked at EPing, I know we've got some inquiry point folks probably participating today who know well what EPing is, but yeah, I mean, you can go in there and find out the notifications. The inquiry points can talk to each other. There's forums. There's national forums for exchanging information. It's just it's sort of a cutting edge tool that the WTO has developed. We're hoping, we think it's going to be expanded to some of the, it's also used for the SPS agreement. So right now, you can get SPS notifications as well as TBT notifications through the system. And we're working in the US to educate our stakeholders about this great resource. Okay, that's it.
So, Renee, thank you very much. And sorry for the technical difficulties, but I think we're expecting this to continue running smoothly. So we do have a couple of questions coming from Tobias. So before we get into additional ones, Tobias, if you could be so kind to open your microphone and, if possible, your camera, so you can voice your questions directly to Renee, that would work much better, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Maybe, I don't know, for any because my laptop camera is not good. But Rene can hear me. Can she?
Yes, she can. We all can. So perfect. Yes.
There's a place where she was listing the list. I think there were almost 10, number 1 up to 10, that were listing some good regulatory practices. And something captured my attention, and this is on RIA. I think it's number 7, though I'd already put it on the chart. In her presentation, she's indicating that RIA, the conduction of RIA, is where appropriate. Probably I would want her to expound on that, where appropriate. And then, of course, the benefits, also to maybe talk about the benefits of a regulation versus the costs, because those are the issues that comes together with RIA. And then at what point is the cost of a regulation which is imposed on a community or a sector becomes significant? And what do we need to look for while determining the significance of a cost, which comes with the imposing a regulation on a community or a sector? I think those are the questions I have, and probably once she responds on that, I only have one question on international standards. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Tobias. Renee?
Sure. So yes, so with respect to the question about regulatory impact where appropriate, I think that that was noted because there can be some discretion with respect to when RIA is used. I'll give the U.S. example, which is that our regulators don't always conduct regulatory impact assessments. There's other things you can do. You know, you can do risk assessment and other analyses, but it's also an issue of it can be an issue of resources, right? Because it's really important to do the estimations as accurately as possible to carry out the analysis. And maybe you don't need to do a regulatory impact assessment on every single regulation, right? Especially if you have limited capacity, expertise within an economy, and you need to make decisions about where you're going to prioritize and emphasize the use of RIA. In the case of the United States, our determination is when a regulation is going to have a significant economic impact. We have a calculation for that. Every country needs to determine that on its own. The U.S. calculation is a regulation that has impact of over $100 million. And so that's when a RIA is required, but it's not required on all regulation. So significant to us, if it has economic impact, it most likely also has trade impact as well. And so you also asked about assessment of benefits and costs. It's important to have guidance for regulators, instructions to how to calculate benefits and costs. I don't do regulatory impact assessments myself. I'm not an expert on them, but we do have guidance that we provide to our regulators in how to conduct these analyses. And there's also guidance. You know, there's a lot of impact that can't be calculated in turn or quantified. So there's other ways to measure and take that into account. One thing I'd also note is that we are, the United States is thinking about new ways of looking at the impact of regulation. And I say that with respect to understanding the effects on groups we might not have taken into account before. We have some recent guidance on environmental justice. You know, don't put the toxic waste sump next to the toxic waste site next to a low-income community. You know, think about these kinds of effects. We also are doing more to ensure that our regulators reach out to more communities, to tribal, to indigenous groups, think beyond the capital, to go out, to think about the impact more broadly. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Renee. Tobias, would you like to voice your next question, please?
I think Renee's, I want to thank her for that, though we'll still follow it up with her, because maybe if somebody was wondering, if there's a country that doesn't do RIA at all, is there anything wrong? Maybe that's not for her to respond. Just a small question on international standards vis-a-vis the TBT agreement. It's also an because she was trying to relate GRP with how GRP is an important component of while implementing the TBT agreement. GRP and TBT agreement complement, but this is specifically with the use of international standards, so to speak. Because if you look at the WTO TBT agreement under definitions, they make reference to ISO Guide 2. Then the way ISO Guide 2 defines international standards is totally different. I really wanted to hear a comment on that.
I guess I just say that, one thing that's important to remember is that the TBT agreement and the SPS agreement really, in a way, they provided the basic, the components that helped us to build out good regulatory practices more broadly. There was just a thematic session on good regulatory practices at the committee last fall, and we talked about this a little bit. I mean, the agreement's been around for a while, and so there, and these principles of transparency, use of international standards, all of these things were developed before we started to talk about, good regulatory practices in trade agreements. The use of international standards is something that, it's, as I mentioned, the OECD, APEC, they all are recognizing the benefits of international standards in terms of getting that regulatory alignment between economies. And so, we do identify that as a good regulatory practice wherever possible, to use those international standards. It's really one of the most common activities that helps to facilitate regulatory cooperation. I don't have a specific comment on the guide too, because I don't have my agreement in front of me right now, but we can talk about that later.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I know we are about the time that we should be closing this session, but I would not like to leave this one without asking probably only one more, even though we have thought about several more. But probably, what in your experience are some of the biggest barriers to governments implementing ERP? And on the other side, what are the biggest benefits that they can derive after their implementation? If you could share a little bit on that.
Well, the one of the biggest barriers is not having those fundamental laws and mechanisms in place, right? Even more important than that is having the high-level political commitment to implement the good regulatory practices. We've, in the U.S., our guidance dates back, it's the 1940s, right? When we had our Administrative Procedure Act. We have executive orders that talk about, regulatory quality and reducing regulatory burden that have stayed in place across different changes in political leadership. So you need that fundamental support and that consistency in the use of the practices. The other barrier is that there seems to be this strong, bright line between the trade and the regulatory folks, right? The trade people are talking about the TBT agreement, but the regulators don't necessarily understand that they are obligated to implement the TBT agreement. I mean, so you need the coordination mechanisms to make sure that the regulators understand their international trade obligations. We also have guidance in the US that our regulators are supposed to use voluntary consensus standards wherever possible. They're not supposed to develop unique standards. So you need those kinds of processes, guidance in place, and to make sure that they're consistently applied. And I think those are kind of the biggest challenges that we've experienced. The benefits, you know, at a high level in terms of quantifying how the impact of these, it's hard to break out the GRPs from everything else at the macroeconomic level just to demonstrate that they really do have impact. But, you know, I think that the fact that there is so much activity internationally in areas like medical devices to try to harmonize regulation shows the value. It's the benefits for not duplicating there's no need to keep recreating regulatory frameworks, right? If things have been tested and they work and safety is ensured, it's not really necessary to keep going back, and everybody who doesn't have the resources creating their own structures and testing requirements and everything. A lot of that has been facilitated through the application of the GRPs, but also through regulatory cooperation efforts. So there's the benefits sometimes may be hard for people to understand, but there's clear value there, and fundamentally also just, I always have to get back to transparency, just having the information accessible so it's well understood what's necessary to comply with regulatory requirements in a particular market, or just, you know, all kinds of compliance information, understanding which agency is responsible for, you know, implementing a particular regulation and enforcing it. All those that kind of information needs to be transparent.
Renee, thank you very much. And you know that we may have like another dozen of questions at least, but we're running out of time for this specific session. Thank you very much. And you know, I mean, thank you also for accepting to moderate the next session. So I'd like to invite Anastasia, if you can open up your camera, and if you, so Renee, and you can get started with the next session. Thank you very much.
I think, thanks, Anna. So go ahead, and I don't know if you have any slides that you wanted to share, but looking forward to this this presentation, and then we'll have some questions for you after that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renee. Sandra, I was wondering if you can share my presentation, my slides.
Whatever you prefer, Anastasia. You can share your screen directly, or I can do that for you. Just let me know.
If you can do that, that would be great. But if not, I can try to do it.
Just give me 1 second, so I will upload the deck.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
So I'm on it. If you would like to get started with your comments while I open it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anastasia Koltunova. I'm a legal officer at the World Trade Organization. I work with Trade and Environment Committee, and among others, I specialized on the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade. And in this capacity, I also support the work of the WTO Committee on technical barriers to trade. So today today my presentation will focus on the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade, and I'll focus on obligations and disciplines that are more directly relevant for the work of national regulatory authorities. And Renee has already covered a lot of disciplines, so I'll try to be complementary as possible and try to add value to what was already covered by Renee. And can you hear the next slide, please? The WTO-TBT agreement entered into force in 1995. And as Renee mentioned, this is because of the growing importance of regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures for international policy, for international trade policy and trade. The agreement covers three types of the measures, though some mandatory technical regulations, voluntarily standards, and conformity assessment procedures. The agreement applies to both agricultural and industrial products, and the agreement specifies that it does not apply to services, it does not apply to government procurement, and it also does not apply to sanitary and phytosanitary measures, because for this we have a separate SPS agreement. So the name of the agreement, technical barriers to trade, can be quite confusing and misleading and create an impression that this is about barriers to trade. But in fact, what the agreement is trying to achieve is to promote the use of better regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures. And so the objective of the TBT agreement is to try to find a balance between members' right to adopt regulations for various public policy goals, such as protection of human life and health, animal life and health, environment, national security, other public policy goals, and at the same time ensure that such regulations do not discriminate and do not unnecessarily restrict international trade. So basically, the agreement is about finding a balance between this right to regulate and the need to for regulations to comply with a set of disciplines and requirements. And one of the ways of achieving such a balance between a right to regulate and the need to pursue trade liberalization is to use international standards. And can I have the next slide, please? And international standards and harmonization based on international standards is actually one of the key principles under the WTO-TBT agreement. And there are also other key principles and disciplines in the agreement that help to achieve this balance. Those are multiple transparency obligations. The agreement also encourages regulatory cooperation and the use of coherence tools. Also not in the slide because of the limited amount of time for this presentation, but the agreement also requires that members, when using, adopting, or applying their technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures, they do not discriminate against imported products vis-a-vis domestic products. And the agreement also prohibits from discriminating among products of different origin. The agreement also requires that members in their regulations avoid unnecessary obstacles to international trade, what means that regulations shall not be more restrictive than necessary for achieving certain public policy goals.
No.
Yeah. And can I have next slide, please? And now I would like to look in more details with respect to three key obligations that are international standards, regulatory coherence and cooperation tools, and transparency. And so let's start with international standards. And can I have the next slide, please? The TBT agreement does not only encourage and promotes, but rather requires members to use international standards as a basis for domestic technical regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures. This is because the use of international standards is essential for products that are traded internationally. So when and the rationale of this requirement is the following. So basically, when technical specifications are different in different markets, traders must contend with additional costs and delay for redesigning products, for accessing information with respect to different regulatory requirements in different countries. And this clearly can discourage traders from participating in international trade. And of course, it limits international trade opportunities for products. And when countries base their domestic regulations on international standards, and they do not basically reinvent the wheel, so all regulations are harmonized, which adds up opportunities for different producers to trade products internationally. And can I have the next slide, please? According to the TBT agreement, members are required to use relevant international standards where such standards exist or their completion is imminent as a basis for technical regulations, conformity assessment procedures, and also national standards. So this is a general rule. But at the same time, the agreement recognizes that in certain cases, it would not be appropriate to use international standards for all countries. So the agreement allows to deviate from this rule in case where international standards are not relevant or where they would be ineffective or inappropriate for achieving certain public policy objectives. And the agreement provides with a few examples where this can be a case, for example, due to fundamental climatic or geographical factors, technological problems, and others. The agreement also recognizes that for developing country members and for LDCs, in certain cases, it would be also inappropriate to use international standards as a basis for their domestic TBT measures because of their special development, financial, and trade needs. So in certain cases, developing countries members are also are exempted from the obligation to use international standards. And can I have the next slide, please? So the agreement also encourages to use a number of regulatory cooperation and coherence tools. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of such requirements is to recognize foreign conformity assessment results, even when they differ from the procedures of conformity assessment are different from the procedures that are applicable in a certain country. And the agreement also encourages to negotiate and conclude mutual recognition agreements. And these requirements are contained in Article 6 of the agreement. But as you can see, the language of such requirements are more soft as compared to the language with respect to the use of international standards. So members are rather encouraged to use such regulatory coherence tool. And can I have the next slide, please? So just to recap, so we were talking about regulatory cooperation and coherence tools that are encouraged by the TBT agreement, and we first look into the requirement is the provision that encourages to accept foreign conformity assessment results, and the other regulatory cooperation tool is a TBT agreement encourages members to adopt and formulate international systems for conformity assessment. Next slide, please. And the third regulatory cooperation and coherence tool that is encouraged by the agreement is to recognize as equivalent technical regulations of other members, even in those cases where technical regulations differ from one country to another one. So this regulatory cooperation and reliance tools, they help members to avoid duplications. They help them to avoid to undergo through the same conformity assessment procedures, and they promote in such a way more efficient use of resources, both for traders and for national regulatory authorities, and eliminating such unnecessary differences in regulations. So duplicative conformity assessment procedures can help both to save time and money for traders, and to increase opportunities for participating in international trade. Can we have the next slide, please? And also the TBT agreement envisages a number of transparency obligations, which are quite detailed and advanced as compared, for example, with other WTO covered agreements, and they are aiming at promoting regulatory cooperation among other goals. Can I have the next slide, please? So here in this slide, you can see some of the key transparency obligations in the TBT agreement, and Renee has already covered some of them. So one of the key obligations is the obligation to notify regulations in a draft form. I would like to spend in a bit of more time to explore on this requirement in a minute. The agreement also requires members to publish their adopted regulations, and this requirement also involves an obligation to provide a reasonable interval between the publication of the final measure and its entry into force, and normally it's about 6 months. Members are also required under the TBT agreement to establish inquiry points in their countries that would be able to respond to any questions and requests with respect to technical regulations, standards, conformity assessment procedures, and if necessary, to provide any information with respect to such regulatory measures. The agreement also requires to designate authority who will be responsible for notifying regulations to the WTO. Another obligation is to provide one-time statement of implementation of agreement, which means that members need to notify to the WTO measures that were taken in order to ensure the implementation of the TBT agreement in a particular country. And also standard setting bodies, they are required to notify each 6 months their work program with respect to the development of standards. And can I have the next slide, please? As mentioned, one of the key transparency obligations in the agreement is the obligation to notify new or modified technical regulations, conformity assessment procedures in a draft form. So at an early stage, even before they are being adopted. According to the text of the agreement, it is necessary to notify such draft regulations in case where they are not based on relevant international standards, or in case where there are no international standards that would govern a particular subject or issue which is being addressed by a technical regulation. And another requirement is to notify measures when in a draft form where they have significant impact on international trade. The agreement encourages members to notify such draft measures at an early stage, so to give enough time for members to review such new measures, to go back to their stakeholders, and to see whether there are any questions or concern with respect to the proposed regulation. And normally, members are required to provide a 60-day comment period for members to to review proposed regulations. And the agreement also requires members to take into consideration all the comments which were provided by other trading partners with respect to their draft new or modified technical regulations or conformity assessment procedures. And actually notifying new measures and having these discussions, perhaps bilateral consultations, exchanges, is actually one of the form of regulatory cooperation among or between countries, and can serve as a first step at establishing cooperation between economies. Can I have the next slide, please? So here you can see notification with respect to medical devices that were submitted to the WTO by members. As you can see, like normally we have about 3,000-4,000 of TBT notifications per year. So members are quite serious with respect to complying with TBT notification provisions. And with respect to medical devices, as you can see in recent years, the number of notification increased, and this is in part because of the impact of the pandemic, which involved a number of new technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures, or certain changes with respect to the existing regulations. And can I have the next slide, please? So here you can see an example of notification. For example, 2 years ago, Uganda notified draft standards with respect to surgical gowns and drapes. And here you can see content of such notification. And this is basically a standard template, which is being used by members when they submit their notification. So here you can see information about the agency responsible for respective draft standard product coverage. Members often also notify HS codes, which will be impacted by a new regulation. Such notification also provide a short description of the content of the measure, and also explain the rationale, objectives that was the basis for proposing certain new measures. Next slide, please. Yeah, here you can see just another example of such notifications. Kenya submitted a notification during COVID period with respect to block swaps, minimum requirements, testing methods, and their use. And you can also see all the relevant information with respect to a new measure. Next slide, please. And also sometimes members also notify their regulatory cooperation efforts. And again, during COVID, we had a number of such notifications. And for example, Brazil, instead of conducting its own inspection on medical goods, such as pharmaceuticals, medical device, so they decided to accept information from other regulators that participate in the pharmaceutical inspection cooperation scheme. Next slide, please. So, and yeah, Renee has already covered our EPIN, SPS, and TBT platform. And yeah, we also agree that this is a great tool for both tracking notifications, a specific trade concern, and staying updated with respect to new measures being adopted or proposed by WTO members. And this is also a great research tool to better understand tendencies with respect to measures notified to the WTO. And yeah, just to repeat, it is possible to subscribe to this platform and to receive email alerts based on products or market of interest. So it can be 1 week email alert with respect to all relevant notifications and updates. And right now, and it is important to know that this platform is not only being used by governments, it is being used very actively by stakeholders. And right now we have about 20,000 of users of this platform. And basically all the notifications are being submitted, SPS and TBT notifications, they're being submitted through this platform. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the WTO TBT committee, because its work helps also to promote a regulatory cooperation, and in a way serves a forum for members to cooperate on different regulatory issues. And this is a committee that that helps to administer the WTO TBT agreement. All members are welcome to participate in the work of the TBT committee, which meets 3 times per year, and also holds a number of informal meetings and thematic sessions. Next slide, please. So basically, there are 2 main areas of committee work. The first one is review of so-called specific trade concerns. So basically, a WTO member can raise in the TBT committee certain specific trade concern issue with respect to regulation adopted by other member. And this can be a concern about adopted or proposed measures. And the concerns can vary from, for example, request for additional information to flag in certain issues with respect to consistency of the measures with the disciplines of the TBT agreement. For example, consistency with transparency, I'm so sorry. Apparently, yeah, problems with my internet connection, but let me continue. I'm so sorry for that.
No, please, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the other area of work in the committee is information exchange on different issues such as harmonization, transparency, and often such information exchange exercises lead to development of so-called soft law of the committee in the form of decisions and recommendations. And also members often hold thematic sessions with respect to different cross-cutting issues of interest. For example, each year we have a thematic session on good regulatory practices. And for example, last year we had a session that explored good regulatory practices provisions and chapters in free trade areas agreement. And other sessions also can help to explore how to improve good regulatory practices. Next slide, please. So, and here you can see a few examples of specific trade concerns that were discussed in the TBT committee and that concern medical goods. For example, members raised concern with respect to EU medical device regulation, and you can see different issues were involved, such as certain practical issues, such as insufficient numbers of conformity assessment bodies accredited to certify and test medical devices, which kind of signals that members, when voicing their concerns during the TBT committee meetings, they also have certain feedback from relevant stakeholders, traders, and which are at the end of the day are being voiced at a committee which is open for all WTO members. So in a way, it also serves as a tool to cooperate with respect to the development of TBT measures. And next slide, please. And also, so the second area of work of the TBT committee, as I have just mentioned, is the information exchange in order to develop certain decisions and recommendations to facilitate the implementation of the TBT agreement. And for example, in 2021, during the pandemic, members agreed to examine and compile best regulatory practices for future pandemic preparedness. This is because regulatory measures played an important role in responding to pandemic and ensuring prompt access to essential medical goods and devices. And so this is a project the members are working on right now in the committee. Next slide, please. So members, they have not developed yet the list of such good practices. This is still an ongoing work. But here on the slide, you can see a list of practices and approaches that were shared by members during a number of discussions that took place in the TBT committee, and also measures that were notified by members in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As you may know, one of the biggest problems during the pandemic was to ensure prompt access to essential medical goods, and sometimes relevant stakeholders and members observed that because regulations, conformity assessment procedures are not harmonized across countries, so it actually caused a delay in delivery of such essential medical goods. So basically, and as you can see from the list of those practices, when members use international standards, when they are being transparent with respect to their TBT measures, in this case with respect to medical goods that are being used to fight a pandemic, helped to facilitate international trade in such essential medical goods and ensure prompt delivery of such goods. And can I have the next slide, please? And the other practices that were used during the pandemic is, for example, use of IT tools for conducting remote conformity assessment procedures where it was impossible to have in-person inspection. Members also tended to recognize and accept conformity assessment results of other members, and they relied on international regulatory cooperation and provided technical assistance for, especially for developing and least developed countries, to support the application of such practices. And next slide, please. Yeah, and to conclude, I wanted to give a few key takeaway messages. So the first one is that when we leverage regulatory cooperation and reliance, we have less duplicative work, and so we help to promote more efficient use of resources, but by both regulators and manufacturers. And this is beneficial both for traders and for national regulatory authorities. So at the end of the day, we have better regulations, facilitated regulations that are at the same time help us to achieve our legitimate public policy goals. Narrowing unnecessary difference in regulations between countries has benefits for both health and trade. And as demonstrated by the pandemic, when we have harmonized regulations, we can ensure prompt access to essential medical goods, what is especially relevant during public health emergencies. Cooperation is very important for those regulators who have less resources, less technical capabilities to contend with complex technologies embedded in medical goods. And so they should leverage different forms of regulatory cooperation. This can be having a bilateral consultation, participating in the work of the TBT committee, or this can be a more advanced form of cooperation, such as including good regulatory practices provisions in the free trade agreements. And leveraging the use of good regulatory practices such as transparency, public consultations, and internal coordination helps to enable these efforts, as was mentioned a few times by Renee during her presentation. And the TBT agreement, actually, because as you can see here, a few good regulatory practices are actually legal obligations in the TBT agreement that are obligatory for the WTO member states. So in a way, better compliance with the disciplines under the TBT agreement can lead to better regulations and to enhanced regulatory cooperation among economies. And I think this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry for technical problems, and yeah, I'm happy to address any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. And we know that Renee is also experiencing some issues while trying to gain access to the Q&A feature and the chat box. Anyway, I don't see questions right now in the chat box, but you know that and Renee, we can probably get started if there's anything that you would like to share and to ask to Anastasia, and then I can also voice some of the questions that we also have for you. So Renee?
Thank you, Anastasia, for that presentation. It was quite thorough, and I think you really did do a great job of showing the link between the TBT agreement and good practices more broadly. I think, like, as we're focused primarily on the medical tech sector here, you emphasized, the transparency provisions of the agreement. So notifying existing and planned actions, taking comments into account, addressing those comments are critical, right? So I wanted to ask if you mentioned the pandemic, right? And a lot of the TBT agreement was one of the most frequently used WTO agreements during the pandemic to notify these measures. So can you talk a little bit about how you did talk about it a little bit, but the importance of how those notifications help to facilitate trade during the pandemic, and and how members might potentially change their practices moving forward as a result of trying to be flexible and relying, and they used it during the pandemic. Can they continue to do these kinds of things moving forward?
Thank you very much, Renee, for your great question. Indeed, during the pandemic's time, we had plenty of trade measures notified to the WTO, taken in response to the pandemic, and almost half of them were notified under the TBT agreement. Both technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures were notified. And I think one of the ways how transparency obligations to notify such measures can contribute to response to the pandemic in that case is that, for example, certain economies that have more limited resources and a less advanced quality infrastructure, they can see the approaches that are being taken by other members in response to the pandemic, and they can see if it would be appropriate and effective for them to pursue such approaches and also adopt a similar measures. And actually, this is what we saw during the pandemic. Members mostly notified trade facilitating measures that were aiming, instead of restricting trade, to facilitate trade and speed up delivery of essential medical goods. And also, we saw, for example, with respect to remote conformity assessment procedures, members notified.
And then we can discuss next steps.
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
I think there was some interference. Go
okay,
ahead.
okay, yeah. And for example, members often notified emergency use of remote tools for conformity assessment procedures. And we also had a number of discussions in the TBT committee, so-called specific trade concerns with respect to trade measures adopted by other members, and members often requested other members to consider utilization of such IT tools for conformity assessment procedures in situation where international travel were not possible. So I think this also one of the results of the transparency obligations under the agreement, because members can see that those remote conformity assessment procedures, as an example, were measures taken by other members, and sometimes there were even requests to adopt such measures that were voiced during the meetings of the TBT committee.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned that medical technologies are becoming much more complex, and it's important that there be cooperation. You had, you've noted, you'd used the word reliance, so I think it might be interesting if you could share a little bit in terms of what reliance means in terms of cooperation among members through the TBT committee.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and this is all. I can also link this to the pandemic, and to, for example, to notifications that I showed of Brazil. So members sometimes. So there is a Article 6 of the agreement that encourages to accept foreign conformity assessment results, even if the procedures for such conformity assessment is different from the procedure of a particular accepting country. And for example, during the pandemic, members accepted such conformity assessment results, especially those that were performed by so-called stringent regulatory authorities. So, and the aim is, of course, to speed up international trade in those products and to facilitate approval of such products. But of course, here an important element is trust. So regulators first need to build trust among each other, so to feel comfortable enough to accept conformity assessment results, for example, of other regulators. And to this end, of course, other forms of regulatory cooperation, from bilateral consultations, discussions, to adopting free trade agreements with more advanced regulatory cooperation provisions is important. So yeah, I would say first build trust, which then can play a role at accepting foreign conformity assessment results and enhancing reliance on such regulatory work of other members.
Renee, if I may, we have a question in the chat box. So if it is okay with you, then I'm going to be voicing it. So the question says, well, thank you for the presentation, very insightful. My question is specifically on the emergency use regulation changes on pack sizes. This has had a dramatic impact in our market, South Africa, where previously we could buy single units, now need to procure multiple pack-sized units, which has a profound impact on inventory holding. Does anyone have any information to share on this, please? Thank you. Probably it's very, very specific, but...
Yeah, I must confess, I do not know all of almost 50,000 of notifications submitted to the committee, but I just might suggest to perhaps check EPIN, SPS and TBT platform, to see whether this measure was notified to the committee, and if so, maybe check specific trade concern with respect to this measure, if any. But unfortunately, I cannot provide with any further information in this measure.
Yeah, I mean, very well understood. Thank you very much. So we'll see and follow up if required, and we will definitely follow up offline to learn more details on if there's a need for a further action to be taken. Renee, if I may, and just taking advantage of the flexibility for our panelists, if I may, probably I'd have a couple of questions for Anastasia. I mean, we understand that in order for TBT agreement to be implemented, it requires a specific effort, not only by the National Regulatory Authority, where the Trade Ministry has a role in ensuring compliance with the TBT agreement, but the regulatory authority itself, I mean, you were mentioning they have a role. So could you expand on this, what TBT responsibilities regulators have beyond the trade ministries?
Yeah, basically the TBT agreement, of course, it imposes obligations on members and relevant relevant regulatory authorities, and the agreement also establishes certain requirements on members with respect to the compliance of local government bodies and non-government bodies with the TBT agreement, meaning that members shall take reasonable measures that are available to them to ensure that non-government bodies and local government bodies comply with the requirements under the TBT agreement.
And thank you very much, Anastasia, because sometimes, and I think it happens among all relevant stakeholders, that we had probably, not probably, I mean, for sure, kind of like a misconception that all TBT related obligations are of the purview of the ministries of trade. And that is something that really, I mean, they are kind of like the representatives, but at the end of the day, it's any regulatory agency, despite the area that they are responsible to regulate, are, could say, covered under the same umbrella in regards of obligations to comply with TBT. Is this correct for me to say like that?
Well, so the obligations that are envisaged by the agreements, they are obligation of members. And I would imagine that not only one ministry participates in the adoption of a particular technical regulation or conformity assessment procedure. So the obligation eventually would be on a member state as a member to the World Trade Organization, but of course it doesn't mean that it is only one ministry that is responsible for complying with the TBT agreement provisions. Those are all relevant authorities that are engaged in the development of a regulation.
That's one of the reasons, if I may note, that coordination is a good regulatory practice, because coordination provides that opportunity for communication between authorities to make sure they're meeting their WTO obligations, to make sure the regulation's not duplicating what another regulator's already done, all those kinds of things. So coordination is a fundamental to effective good regulatory practice. But so Anastasia, is there any training for the inquiry points to help them to work with their regulatory authorities to help build that coordination?
Training. Some of my colleagues, they provide technical assistance activities for, especially for developing and least developed countries who are interested in enhancing their quality infrastructure. And we often have, for example, trainings on EPIN and tailor-made trainings on transparency obligations under the agreement, including obligations of the inquiry points under the TBT agreement. So yeah, this is part of work of the Secretariat, and actually we have plenty of requests right now to provide certain trainings with respect to the broad disciplines of the TBT agreement, and we also have more tailor-made courses on transparency, EPIN, and including inquiry points and their obligations under the agreement. You're muted,
Sorry,
Sandra.
yeah, so sorry. I was coughing, I closed it, so sorry. But you're talking about coordination, you and Renee are talking about coordination. And probably something that happens every now and then is that there is a different understanding between a regulatory authority and the trade ministry in regards of the definition on whether a piece, if a piece of regulation is a technical regulation or if it is not. Or how can we help the authorities to try to come with the best possible answer whenever situations like that happen? Is there any tool that can help kind of like identify which is the criteria that have to be fulfilled, or what are the criteria that are to be fulfilled in order to confirm whether there is a technical regulation in that case or not?
Yeah. Yes. So there is an Annex 1 to the TBT agreement, and that contains a definition of what is technical regulation, what is standard, and what is conformity assessment procedure. So yeah, as mentioned, the agreement covers only 3 types of measures. If this is not technical regulation, standard, conformity assessment procedure, the agreement does not apply. And if I may share my screen so I can, maybe I can show you those criterias. Bear with me for a second, please. Okay. Okay, for example, this one. Can you see my screen, Annex 1?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so here you can see the definition. So this is Annex 1 of the TBT agreement, and you can see the definition of technical regulation, standard, conformity assessment procedure, right? For example, so there are basically 3 criteria for a measure to constitute technical regulation. So it must be a document which lays down product characteristics or their related processes and production methods, including the applicable administrative provisions. And the last criterion is that the compliance with such document must be mandatory. And the agreement also lists a couple of examples of measures that can be that are technical regulations, such as, for example, packaging, labeling, marking, symbols, terminology requirements. And there is actually jurisprudence of previous WTO panels and appellate bodies with respect to understanding those criteria. But what we primarily rely on, of course, is the very text of the agreement. It is Annex 1, which should shed some light on what measures are being understood as technical regulations.
Anastasia, that prompts me to just comment that, we focus a lot on technical regulations, but it's often the conformity assessment procedures that create the barriers to trade. Could you talk a little bit more? You did mention in your presentation, like mutual recognition, there's use of international systems of conformity assessment. I know the committee has the indicative list of conformity assessment procedures, and there's work now to provide guidance to regulators on conformity assessment. So just if you could just mention some of these ways that the agreement helps members to facilitate trade through conformity assessment rather than it creating a barrier to trade.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Renee. So first of all, the agreement, the TBT agreement disciplines the use of conformity assessment procedures, and all conformity assessment procedures which are being prepared, adopted, or applied by WTO members, they shall not be discriminatory. They cannot create unnecessary obstacles to international trade. Members also need to comply with transparency obligations when it comes to conformity assessment procedures. So the same obligations to notify measures in draft form to the WTO TBT committee, provide comment period, publish final conformity assessment procedures. Yeah, we already mentioned Article 6 that encourages acceptance of foreign conformity assessment results. And as you rightly pointed out, there is an important work going on right now in the committee. So during this triennial period, members agreed to finalize their work with respect to the adoption of non-prescriptive voluntary guidance for that would facilitate regulators' work in the choice and design of conformity assessment procedures. So so members are trying to develop decision recommendation with respect to which would help regulators to use appropriate conformity assessment procedures depending on, for example, risk involved of non-compliance with certain technical regulations. And this is also one of the form of regulatory cooperation in the committee to eventually have this guidance to facilitate members' use of conformity assessment procedures, and in a way that would not create unnecessary bottlenecks to international trade.
Thank you very much. And probably before we just wrap up this session, we have a question in the Q&A. It is from Fatime Rajuyan. And her question is, from your perspective, what would be the next step to moving towards the implementation of reliance broadly beyond the pandemic?
What can I say from the TBT agreement perspective? Of course, we only can encourage, as stated in the very text of the TBT agreement, regulatory reliance in order to facilitate trade and to avoid creating unnecessary bottlenecks for international trade. And I think the pandemic has shown that we need to think about building trust and developing reliance among regulators before such emergency situations as pandemic, because lessons learned during the pandemic is that when we don't have trust, reliance, harmonization based on international standards, that this can have very negative impact on prompt response to the pandemic. So as this experience shown, is the more we work before next pandemic happens, the more efficient and effective response would be to the next pandemic.
Thank you. Renee, anything that you would like to add to this? Your microphone is closed, I guess.
No, thank you. I think she's covered the territory quite well. Thank you for that comprehensive presentation.
Well, thank you very much to you too, Renee and Anastasia. And then I think it is time for our last session. Well, we will keep Renee with us, and then I'll invite Stephen Bibes and Tobias Ololo to join us for the conversation. And Stephen, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you for that last panel, very informative. I'm a member of the MDRC project team, filling in for our Tier 1 GRP lead today. And it is my honor to officiate this portion of the agenda where we turn to a conversation on African regional trade and good regulatory practices. For this, we have with us Tobias Ololo, of the Kenyan Bureau of Standards, KEBS, which represents the government of Kenya at the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. Mr. Lolo is manager for standards with KEBS and has leadership roles with the EAC and COMESA. Renee Hansher from USTR was kind to join us for this last session and this conversation after so helpfully leading us through the introductory session and that last panel as well. We'll start this session with a focus on Kenya and then broaden the scope continentally. And perhaps I can begin by attempting to summarize and synthesize the context of what was just laid out, because we did cover significant ground. The subject of good regulatory practices has now matured into its own discipline with its own international reference documents, ranging from those of the OECD, as was mentioned, to the provisions of the WTO TBT Committee and agreement, and even now codified within regional and bilateral trade agreements as binding commitments on the regulatory process. The function of GRP is inherently domestic in terms of its implementation and benefits, and providing a standardized framework for the regulatory process across the whole of government. But GRP also has benefits to international trade and critically impacts global supply chains. One of the key takeaways from the earlier sessions is that the provisions of the WTO TBT agreement pertain to the regulatory process, in particular regarding technical regulations, which comprise a substantive subset of all regulations. The TBT agreement in this regard represents a noteworthy set of treaty-based requirements for the regulatory authorities of the 164 members of the WTO for this substantive subset of all regulations, which happen to be technical. And it is in this context that we appreciate the focus that the WTO TBT Committee has placed in recent years on understanding TBT as GRP. Although it can easily get camouflaged by the trade lingo, the WTO TBT notification requirement and process through the EPING system really is a mandatory 60-day minimum global public consultation requirement on draft and final technical regulations from the regulatory authorities of those 164 WTO members. As some examples that were noted, TBT Article 2.2 requires that technical regulations not be more trade restrictive than necessary, which is a type of least burdensome requirement. Article 2.3 requires that outdated technical regulations be withdrawn, which is a type of retroactive review requirement. And Article 2.4 requires that national regulatory authorities use international standards as a basis for national technical regulations, which in the health sector is referred to as one aspect of regulatory reliance. And these TBT as GRP elements constitute a layer of the international, regional, and national legal frameworks for the development and maintenance of technical regulations. And we're all working to ensure that whatever technical regulations are in place are not just effective, but they have the proper legal foundation. Broad GRP, however, builds upon the TBT agreement and goes beyond it to the elements that Renee presented earlier, and as Anastasia presented earlier, applicable to all regulations. So with the table set, Tobias, I'd like to start the conversation with you and invite you to relay to this audience how Kenya, as one country, connects with the WTO TBT Committee, to explain the role of KEBS in this regard, to convey the rationale behind and benefits of Kenya deciding to comply with the treaty-based provisions of the TBT, and how all of this serves as a legal basis applicable to the development of technical regulations and standards in Kenya and in the broader regions of the EAC, COMESA, and Africa. There's a lot to cover there, so I invite you to tackle that intro in whatever way you think makes the most sense for this audience. So over to you, Tobias.
Hey, that was mouthful. Yeah, but apparently, as I indicated through my laptop, I'm not able, you will not be able to see me, but I'm able to project. I don't know whether Sandra will do that for me or I can project from my end. Sandra, because I had made changes to my presentation, did you receive
Yes.
the last slides?
Yes,
The one yes, so if you can project for me, please.
Yes, I am on it right now. Just give me 1 second. And I guess everybody can see it now.
There you are. Maybe just a small correction to the introduction by Bipes. Currently, of course, when it comes to WTO, there's a colleague of mine, Lucy Konya, I think Sandra knows her, Rene, she's actually our national WTO TBT committee secretary. And for that, she represents KEBS. And of course, there are other committee members to the WTO. So currently, in terms of the negotiations with the US, I lead the team, but for the purposes of WTO, my colleague Lucy Konya is the representative from KEBS. So next slide, please. I just wanted to make that clarification. Yeah, I may try to, this will look like Rene presenting, but I think I wanted to add this as a background so that you can, the audience who are in this call can really appreciate that we are in harmony or we are synchronized with the presentations of what Rene was saying about GRP, because as you can see, good regulatory practices basically refers to procedures which are involved when you are considering to develop or to adopt law or regulations or even standards. And they also look at it is an international best practice which calls for a very, very, very tight public-private consultations before you think of coming up with a law, a regulation, or a standard. Before it, you also think of adopting the same. It also requires issues to do with advance notices, which involve the publication of a draft for what you call meaningful public comment, because some of those public comments may be found not to be very meaningful, depending on probably the information you are seeking, the time frame you have given, the people you are circulating the document to. So it requires that, and also, again, the government response, adoption, and appropriate transition periods. That basically summarizes even the provisions under WTO TBT agreement, the transition periods, the comment periods, and etc. It also entails what Rene was actually talking about, and we still also find it very difficult on how to calculate and see whether the benefits of coming with this law or a regulation, the interest, what you are trying to regulate vis-a-vis the costs or the burden that the law is going to impose on the community or the sector that are required to apply. So again, it is also important that while thinking of coming up with the law, the GRP requires that you need to also find out whether the benefits outweigh costs, particularly if they may bring issues of cost that are burdensome on the private sector and may also discourage competition. Next, please. So that is basically the background that seems to be almost similar, I think, if not the same, with what Rene talked about. So just to start off, maybe I just wanted to let you know that as Kenya, we enacted a law which is called the Statutory Instrument Act. It is number 23, and it was enacted in 2013. So this law provides for the making, scrutiny, publication, operation of statutory instruments, where statutory instruments are defined to include, but not mainly limited to, the laws, regulations, etc. And then, of course, the Act also provides a comprehensive regime for the making, scrutiny, publication, and operation of the statutory instrument by requiring that those authorities that are having the responsibilities to develop those regulations, they undertake consultations before making the regulations of the statutory instruments. So basically in Kenya, we follow that as provided for in the law. And then it also requires high standards in the drafting of the statutory instruments. This is therefore to promote their legal effectiveness, clarity, and intelligibility to the anticipated users. So next. Next, please. Yes, it continues to provide that it also provides for the improving public access to statutory instruments, and also it establishes improved mechanisms for parliamentary scrutiny, because we have a parliamentary committee in our process of developing statutory instruments through which the scrutiny is done. So it's like it can go there, comes back with questions, of course, through our ages, and back to the regulation making authority to sort out some issues if they are not coming out clearly. It also establishes mechanisms to ensure that those instruments are periodically reviewed. And I think, going by the last speaker, they can also be withdrawn or repealed if they no longer have a continuing purpose. I think this is in line with the provisions of the WTO-TBT agreement that requires that obsolete regulations or laws that are not in sync with the status are supposed to be repealed or removed. So this GRP law, which in Kenya we call it an statutory instrument, is actually is in line with the some provisions of the TBT agreement. Next. Then it has also provisions. Actually, what I'm taking you through is the provisions of the law, and at the same time is what we do as Kenya. So it provides for regulating authorities. They are required to undertake internal consultations. This is a requirement, and they need to consult the people who are likely to be affected by the proposed regulation, and in particular, where the regulation will have a direct or a substantial indirect effect on business or restrict competition. It also says that while they are determining whether any consultation that was undertaken is appropriate, then the regulation making authority is required. Next. The regulation making authority is required to consider any relevant matter, including to the extent to which the consultation that was done, whether it relied on the knowledge of persons having the expertise in that field, which is relevant to the proposed regulation, and also ensure that persons likely to be affected by the proposed regulation had an adequate opportunity to comment on its proposed content. And then, of course, the law requires that this is done through, one, notifications, either directly or by advertisement of bodies that, or of organizations representative of persons who are likely to be affected by the proposed regulation. So in this case, we can either write directly, or we can have it published in the media, both electronic and print, and ensure that those people who are likely to be affected receive this, and then they can be given an opportunity to have their inputs. Also, by inviting, we can also do submissions through a specified, we can have a specified date, or we can invite participation through public hearings concerning the proposed regulation. So whichever way we find it appropriate, depending on the regulation, we apply those provisions that are given in the law. Next. Then the RIA, I think some of the issues that you are going to see here are some of the things I was asking from Rene, because our law also provides us a provision for undertaking impact assessment. And we only do it if the proposed regulation is likely to impose significant costs. Actually, I need to be honest here that, and I think Rene also confirmed that it's not always done. So I cannot be very sure to point out which one we did, but it is a requirement that if the proposed regulation is likely to impose a significant cost, and you can see I put it in bold, on the community or a part of the community, then the regulation making authority is required to conduct RIA and then prepare the statement about that regulation. So basically, as Kenya would say that here we still have a challenge because really do it. I'm not sure whether we've done it. And probably maybe going forward, this is an area that we may need to engage on. And if issues of expertise, I think the issue is not mainly the expertise. Probably it's very expensive also to conduct RIA. So it's an issue of cost that you will be involved on a country to do this. Then of course our law goes ahead and says that if you are to prepare such statement about the RIA, then the statement should contain one, the objective. Why do you want this regulation? Why is it important that we have to develop this regulation? So that will be there. And then also you need to explain the effect of the proposed regulation. How will it affect the community or the sector that the regulation is intended for? Then again, also you need to seek the best reasonable, obtainable information, including scientific, technical, and economic or other information relevant to the regulation when you are starting to develop the said regulation. So apart from the RIA, I think we actually do the rest, because we normally put outside there the statement about the proposed regulation, its objective, and also we explain why we really require this. Next. And then it also indicates that you need to have an assessment of the costs and benefits. I think this is very important, that the people need to know that the costs and benefits of the proposed statutory rule and of any other practical means of achieving the same objective. So here you need to indicate the same, the cost versus benefit. Sometimes you might find that the cost of outweighs the benefits, but you see, it depends. If you are the law is about security, health, or safety, then you would go with it even if the cost outweighs the benefits. Maybe I would want Rene to comment on that. Then the reasons why the selected rule is the preferable. So you need to explain, why is it that this is the preferable one? Can we do with the other? Those need to come out in the statement very clearly. And then of course indicate the periods for commenting, which should not be less than 60 days. I think this is also in sync with the provisions of WTO TBT agreement, specifically under technical regulations and standards. And then the statement has to be advertised, probably in appropriate public accessible online platform or a print. So basically this is what the laws provides in terms of the RIA, and we do that, though we never do the impact assessment, but of course we always have the statement outside there in the public outlining some of those provisions. Next. Next, I think I'm done with that. So I don't know whether I needed to pause. I can see some questions there on PPB. Do I need to pause on that? So that, because the next would just to highlight how Kenya and KEBS implement the WTO TBT agreement. And as you can see there, I have 3 bullets which are expounded below. So can I continue?
Yes, please.
Yes, please continue.
Okay, next. So here I will just give you an experience, because Kenya is a member of WTO. We are the signatory. We are signatories to the WTO agreement, and as such, we have obligations, and and commitments and rights under the agreement. So one of the obligations you'll see coming out clearly is in the implementation. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk about our National TBT Committee and its role. So we'll have the institutional framework, we have the membership, the TORs, administration and challenges. So you'll see we also have challenges in implementing the agreement. So next. Yes, here we do consultations, means that in Kenya, our consultations regarding issues of TBT is normally done through the committee. And then you'll see how that comes out. And the National Notification Authority, which is based at the State Department for Trade. Then we also have the Inquiry Point, NEP, which is based at KEBS. So we have the National TBT Committee, we have the Notification Authority, that is NNA, and then we have NEP. So next. Now, this is the diagram, the structure on how implementation of TBT agreement institutional-wise has been established in Kenya. Of course, it starts from the ministry. Don't mind about the name, because the name has changed now. It's not the way it is. We have it now as the Ministry of Investment. You can say MITI, Investment, Trade and Industry. So the cooperative disappeared, but it's still the same ministry. Basically, the department, the State Department of Trade. So that's where the Notification Authority sits. The authority is notified. It's a notified authority as required by the WTO TBT agreement, and that is under the State Department for Trade, which has not changed. And then under that, we also have a National Trade Negotiations Council. So this is the body that undertakes trade negotiations, which whether it's WTO, whether it's the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, tripartite, even at the EAC level, even COMESA. Then below it, then we have the WTO TBT National Committee that fits into the National Trade Negotiations Council. So WTO TBT Committee mainly deals with the issues relating to the WTO TBT agreement, as you will see in the slides coming below. Then below the TBT Committee, we have the TBT National Inquiry Point, and of course we have other NEPs, probably the ones that deals with issues of SPS. We also have a National Inquiry Point for SPS, but specifically for TBT, the inquiry point is at KEBS. Next. So the National TBT Committee membership, of course, the chair is the State Department for Trade. Then we have Ministries of Health. We have the East African Affairs. We have Agriculture, Veterinary Services, the AGs, the Attorney General's Office. Next. These are the members of the committee. The slide seems to be stuck. It's not moving. We have the KEFIS, the Kenya Plant Health Inspectorate Service. We have the KIPI. This is the competition, the Kenya Industrial Property Institute that deals with the intellectual property, IPR, intellectual property rights. Then you have our National Environment Authority. We have Export Promotion Council. We have the Kenya Investment Authority for issues dealing with investment. We have our National Alcohol Control Authority. Then we have the KenTrade. Then we have Kenya Accreditation Service that handles issues of accreditation, conformity assessment. Those are some of the institutions that deals with certain aspects of the TBT agreement. Next. Then we also have, we are not leaving the consumers outside, then we have consumer bodies that are represented. And then we also have the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, the universities, and then Kenya Bureau of Standards is the secretariat for this committee, given that the national inquiry point is at KEBS. So KEBS is the secretariat for this TBT, National TBT Committee. So basically, in terms of coordination between the committee, the WTO, and our members, KEBS does a lot of coordination since they are the secretariat to this committee. Next. Now we have the TOR. This committee has the TOR. One of them is to review all issues pertaining to TBT. So if there are issues that pertains to TBT, maybe they were discussed in the last TBT committee meeting or they are upcoming. So those issues are filtered. Some of them could be issues that have come through notifications and they require the attention of the committee. So one of their functions is to review all issues pertaining to the TBT chapter and then have a Kenyan position based on some of them, depending on the issues. Then, of course, review the operation and the administration of the TBT agreement in the country. And this is specifically with regard to inquiry and notification obligations. And then again, of course, one of the functions that this committee is supposed to handle is the developments in technical regulations, standards and conformity assessment procedures that are barriers to trade nationally and in trading with other partners. So they have a very big role here in terms of ensuring that those specific provisions of the WTO TBT agreement, which have been dwelt on by other speakers, are taken care of. Of course, the issue of transparency, exchange of information comes in, and it's one of their role to ensure that exchange of information, and they also assist in the coordination among other ministries, as you've seen, because not all the ministries and departments are members of the committee. So the committee also does that role of coordination to make sure that some of those notifications that have come through NEP are responded to, because some of them may come through NEP, but then they require the attention of other government bodies. So the committee has that role to coordinate and make sure that those responses are received. Then, of course, the last, I think this is the last but not the least, the technical, they also do the technical evaluation of all WTO TBT foreign notifications. And yeah, next. The screen has stopped. Okay. So they also review the developments in the committee. They look at the responses, inquiries. I think some of these are just, I think some of them I've mentioned. Of course, they also provide views and other inputs to the, when the WTO TBT agreement is due for review, and then because this is an implementation committee, they could try to provide some of views on how the agreement can be improved when it is due for review, which is done triannually. So the committee has that responsibility. And then, of course, GRP, trade and regulatory practices, GRP aspect is also brought into the attention of the committee. And of course, the national positions with regard to WTO TBT issues, the onward transmission to Geneva. So sometimes we have Kenyan negotiators who are going there, but then the position that they are supposed to take to Geneva is provided for by this committee, because we have to take a Kenyan position. So it doesn't matter who goes there, but the committee has the responsibility to ensure that a Kenyan position is arrived at. depending on the issues that are brought to their attention or that are going to be discussed in the WTO TBT committee meetings. Next. And then, of course, the committee meets at least 3 times a year, and especially when there's an issue. But normally, this committee meets 3 times a year, and also a month before any scheduled WTO TBT committee meeting. It takes place in Geneva. So I think that's for that. Next, I think should be on the NEP. So the typical agenda of the committee is basically they look at the previous issues, what is going on the regional forum, discussion on the TBT regional forum, because in EAC we also have a committee called the EAC TBT regional forum. So they also look at, they may also look at the TBT issues that takes place within the region, that is EAC, even COMESA. Now that we have CFTA on board, tripartite is not yet, the agreement is not in place. So they also discuss the work plan, because in EAC we also have a regional work plan on TBT, so they discuss that. And then of course, the main one is the preparations for the Geneva meetings. Next, I think I need to make this faster because I know there are so many questions for me. So here in these slides, I just want to show, I think I also heard there was a mention by the last speaker on Kenya in notifications. And as you can see, this is in the world, this is not in Africa. This is the top 10 WTO members who produced most notifications in 2018. So as you can see, I think EAC for that matter, and not Africa, EAC for that matter, Uganda takes the lead. That was in 2018. US is coming number 2 down. Kenya, you can see it's number 3, and the list continues. So I think in 2018, we were good. We did quite a number of notifications, but not very close to the US. I think in the next slide, 2019, we dropped. Just check on the 2019, I think we were number 4. Maybe my colleague needs to give the reasons. I don't know where. I think you didn't put the slide, the other slide I shared, but just to mention, 2019 we dropped, 2021 again we came number 3. But in both cases, Uganda is still the lead, and I think followed closely by US, and in between Brazil and Kenya. So we keep on shifting positions. So the next slide is just a photo of my colleague in the Geneva meetings. Push the next slide, please. Next slide. Then, of course, these are the challenges that we normally face, that we normally get limited feedback from the business community on foreign notification. So I think this is very important because the business community, they take a back seat. They think that the WTO TBT agreement is not for them. It's for some special people, maybe government and all that. So as you can see, we have a challenge. When we receive these foreign notifications and we push it to them, they don't give back the feedback. And I think they react. They are not proactive. They react when now the situation goes out of hand. Some regulations have come to play, and now they are feeling. So that's a challenge, and probably we may need to see. I don't know whether it's only for Kenya, but I think this is a challenge everywhere. That the business community don't think that they are part of this agreement, and they don't know how important and how crucial their role is in trying to improve the implementation of this agreement. And I think this is also repeated with our regulators. There are some regulators which are also not taking these notifications serious, even to the extent that sometimes, as much as we have very good GRP laws put in place, sometimes you find that even as the inquiry point, which is KEBS, we also caught by surprise that some regulations are coming and we never notified them. Then, of course, the issue of money. Money has always been there, and of course, the human and the cash capital is always an issue, because some of these notifications may require also to visit some of these institutions and let them know how important it is that they respond to these notifications. And some of these require money. And then, of course, we get notifications from WTO, and sometimes they don't come with the full text. So you get the notification, then the full text takes time. So undertaking national consultation so that you can give a meaningful response, delay, and maybe when you are submitting, the time frame is gone. And those are some of the challenges we experience, and some texts don't come in a language that is understood. So you might find it is in French. Kenya is an English-speaking country. It comes, there is no translation. So by the time we struggle to get that, the time is gone. Next. Yeah, and ready to receive questions.
Thank you, Tobias, for that very helpful information, tying the global TBT and GRP requirements down into the legal frameworks and realities of Kenya and Africa, and with their impacts on trade. Just as an administrative note, we are scheduled to go to the top of the hour. When I was reviewing the schedule the last few days, I thought we might end early, but I'm glad to see that we've had a very rich conversation and a lot of good questions that require answering. So thank you for that. We will go as scheduled for the next 30 minutes to the top of the hour, and I will try and keep us on track. But with all of that, Renee, I'd like to turn to you now for your views on any of what has been covered so far and on the relationships between trade and GRP and their impacts in and with Kenya and broader Africa, and then we can get into some of the questions.
Thank you, Stephen. So I thought that Tobias did a great job of connecting what Kenya is doing on TBT with in terms of its laws and procedures, with connecting that to good regulatory practices. I wanted to sort of emphasize that we shouldn't focus so much on one GRP over another, right? So then they're very much interconnected. So for example, public consultation plays a really important role relative to the regulator being able to assess the impact of a regulation, right? Because you can get some of that information through the public consultation processes that the regulator might not be able to figure out on his own. So I just think it's really helpful to think about all of these in perspective more broadly. Also, he mentioned the engaging the business community. Yes, that's very important, but certainly equally important is making sure all the regulatory authorities are understanding their obligations to make sure that their regulations are notified, right? And that they take the comments into account. So certainly the business community has a role to play in engaging, but also we need to, again, it's balance, regulators and business community together. So just some high level thoughts there from what he shared.
Thank you, Renee. And maybe just a few notes that I took during the conversation and throughout the course of this MDRC project is that GRP is really an informal type of quality management system, in the same way that it would be, as one example from our sector, the medtech sector, it would be unimaginable to have a medical device production line and have a device come straight off the factory and then go straight to the hospital or patient without a quality management system. It should likewise be unimaginable that there would be a piece of regulation that goes straight off the production into the market with a very large impact without having some type of quality management system. And it doesn't need to be ISO 9000, but the GRP, as it was listed and itemized across those elements, serves as a type of check, a type of quality management system. And it's that life cycle that you showed, Renee, of being analyzing the needs and evaluating the possible policy tools, and then if needed, publishing a regular drafting and getting consultation and basing the regulation on international standards, and then continuing that maintenance cycle. And if it's not in a maintenance cycle, it's dead, and there's no way to know whether it's still meeting the regulatory purpose. So that was one item that jumped out for me. Two is that often we've heard that this context of how the lack of GRP can create technical regulations that become technical barriers to trade. And it's often viewed as something, well, that's just something that impacts international. But something that we discovered acutely during COVID-19 is that if the relevant international framework is not in place, it doesn't matter where the medtech is produced. I mean, the industry is global, and it's looking to increasingly expand its footprint in ever more regionally, ever more national production, to have more diverse supply chains that can more resiliently deal with peak demand in a more seamless way without running into bottlenecks. But if the regulatory frameworks are not there and GRP is not implemented, it doesn't matter which factory the medtech is produced in, it will sit on the dock and it will not get to the hospital and the patient. So GRP is not something that's only in the international context. It really is the whole system, domestic or international. The other is that, particularly for countries that are looking to ramp up national production of medtech, we're not just talking the trade of the devices themselves, but the inputs that go into the device. And they're in several jurisdictions are looking to promote production. That's excellent. But those manufacturers, particularly the SMEs, which really form the base of the pyramid of the global medtech industry, they need access to the inputs and the components. And that means not just a clear, fully functioning customs system and trade facilitation and compliance with the trade facilitation agreement, and which is not the scope of today's webinar, but also having these fully functional regulatory systems and regulations and standards that are based upon international standards to really facilitate that. And that's really a key piece of what we've diagnosed as part of the challenge in adequately responding to COVID-19 and to better preparing for future health emergencies. And then on the business community, and I completely agree with what Tobias said, it's often easy for the private sector to look at what may not be done on the government side. But we would say that good regulatory practices and international standards is a co-responsibility of the private sector, and the private sector needs to shoulder its share of the burden in participating in the development of standards, as well as reviewing the EPING system and looking at the draft notifications and then providing sensible, sound-based, science-based comments in response to those public consultations. There aren't enough people in Geneva or Capital, and there aren't the technical experts within Capital that look through these notifications. It's the role of the regulators in the private sector to review those notifications and provide comments in, and that's how the system works. We do have some questions, but I wanted to maybe go back to both Tobias and you, Renee, and with a couple of questions. How does KEBS and how does USTR work with regulatory agencies on implementation of the TBT agreement and on broader GRP? Maybe starting with Tobias.
I think I answered that question because you realize that Kenya, we quickly established a committee. So the National TBT Committee, one of their responsibilities, if you are keen, is coordinating. You know, not all regulators in Kenya are members of the committee. So in let's say, for example, there is some notifications from other countries, or some regulators even may not see the need of doing a notification. So the function of the committee has that role to coordinate the implementation by ensuring that those regulators who are not members of the committee and they make regulations, because you realize from my presentation and even from the statutory instrument, we have a difference within a regulatory authority and a regulation making authority. So these are two entities. There's an authority which does not make regulations, they enforce. But those which have the mandate to make regulations and then they are required to comply. So in answering your question, though KEBS is NEP, of course, we'll receive all those notifications and we filter them which ones require the attention of the committee, and then the committee does the follow-up.
Thank you, Tobias.
Yes.
Maybe I'll pose that to you, Renee, as well. How does USTR work with the U.S. regulatory agencies on implementation of TBT agreement and on broader GRP?
So we certainly have trainings where we work with our regulators to discuss the TBT obligation. With respect to notifications, there is an interagency committee that will work to develop U.S. government comments. We also work with mainly with our Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce. They're the ones who are more closely connected to our business community and our agricultural community, and so they will alert the business community to notifications that come in. And we are also doing a lot of training to get our private sector signed up to EPING, so they get the notifications directly. Certainly, before we go to Geneva, we have a rigorous process to review notifications, specific trade concerns that we might want to raise with members in either bilateral meetings on the margins of the TBT committee or actually raised on the floor of the committee. So there's a detailed process for that. So there's a lot of coordination. I would also note on the side of the GRP side of just U.S. regulations in general, that the interagency does see draft laws before they're and draft regulations before they're released for public comment. So we go through this internal check even before things are posted to make sure we're consistent with our WTO obligations, right? And we can ask questions. So there's internal processes and these other coordination processes that happen. I'd also note that with respect to GRP and our trade agreements, that we include all our regulators as part of our review of our texts before they ever get shared with the trading partner. The interagency is always there with me in these negotiations, and certainly we do have sectoral annexes to some of our agreements to get at these regulatory cooperation issues in areas like medical technology and pharmaceuticals and cosmetics.
Thank you, Renee. Tobias, back to you.
I just wanted to, there's something I've heard Renee mention, because under the WTO TBT agreement, there's a requirement to notify the notification authority. We have those two. We have the NEP for the inquiry, and then we have the notification authority. But I've heard her mention that they can allow other institutions or other government bodies, authorities, to do notification directly. How is that? How do they do it? Because I find it a bit. Then what's the role of the notification authority? Some people can notify directly without passing through the authority, because the authority is there probably to look at the notification itself and own it up, because notifications coming from a country, then it comes like Kenya notified. It doesn't now come like organizations from Kenya did the notification. Maybe probably she can comment on that, because I heard her say that once they do training for some of those organizations, they can notify directly.
Renee?
Yeah, they do not notify directly. We notify through our inquiry point, but we do train them to make sure that they're understanding, what the trade obligations are, the TBT obligations. We also certainly, the U.S. government has guidance for our regulators, and we've got our OMB circular A19. I mean, we have all kinds of guidance that we've provided so the regulators know that they're supposed to look to international standards before they create unique standards, that they're supposed to participate in standards development, things like that. But no, the regulators don't notify directly. They have to go through our inquiry point at NIST.
And
but I would say that
go ahead, please.
Notifications everything that's notified is simultaneously available on our regulations.gov and posted on our Federal Register. There is no, there's no time lag. They're virtually simultaneous. So I mean, we try to be as transparent as possible, but in terms of notifying members, we go through the inquiry point. Our inquiry point looks through our Federal Register and collects those notifications that they think will have trade impact and notifies them.
And I'll note that is one question in the chat. What is PPB's position on the TBT agreement? They're not part of this panel, so I'm going to pass. They will be, but I will suggest to the audience to tune in tomorrow. We're not done yet here, but that they will certainly be on the agenda tomorrow. And I also included a link in the chat on a WTO public forum session we held in September with the participation of PPB and AMDF. And I think that session also speaks for itself and may be enlightening to the question. And we also, maybe I can turn to another question, maybe for Tobias. We'll go through this one first, and then back to some of the other questions. So it says, in light of this significant and active WTO TBT involvement in Kenya, how is KEBS and PPB addressing harmonization convergence with respect to KEBS, the PVOC program, and PPB product registration regulations and requirements as it concerns the medical technology sector to ensure these dual processes do not contribute to barriers to trade in this sector? Maybe Tobias, you first.
Yeah, I saw that question coming. maybe let me start by, I think when you were in Nairobi, we discussed about Article 12 of the USMCA, which is about the sectoral annexes. But something I noticed in that agreement, that medical devices in that agreement is defined differently in the US. We have a definition for what the medical device means in the US, in Canada and Mexico. I think the issue between KEBS and PPB when it comes to medical devices is that probably the issue of the definition, because as you realize during our engagement, there are certain medical devices that are exempted through PVOC process. What KEBS requires just a notification that PPB has cleared this, and then you just allowed to go through. So the issue could be not so very serious because there are some medical devices that are exempted and there are some medical devices that have to go through the KEBS process, and they will not necessarily go through PPB. So maybe probably at that point we will clarify, because I'm not seeing that kind of harmonization with the PPB process vis-a-vis medical devices, because everything is clear. If you look at the KEBS legal notice number 78, I think the current one, though we are still working on it to improve, to upload some of those products that can be exempted. There are several medical devices that don't pass through KEBS PVOC program because they are exempted. We only require a certificate that they have undergone registration with PPB, and that's all. But there are others that falls under the scope of KEBS. So I think that clarity probably is not very clear, and maybe it is still these are also GRP issues. If there are ways and means of which members think that there is need, that whatever we are doing to that extent of exemption is not still good enough, then we are still willing to look at it. And as I indicated, maybe for the rest of the audience, I can see the numbers really dropped from 117 to 81. This is also an issue that we are discussing with the US. So, and the issue of PVOC, because initially Kenya used to run a PSI that Kenya used to run, the pre-shipment inspection, was not in compliant with the TF. That is the trade facilitation agreement. I think Article 13 or something, where that the pre-shipment inspection with respect to evaluation issues to do it is not. But the PVOC or the PSI that we are undertaking currently, which is not being done by the Kenya Revenue Authorities under KEBS, is according to us, and probably I think maybe if I can quote, you also indicated that it is in compliance with the TBT agreement and by extension the TF. So that's how I can answer that question. But if there are feelings that there are certain provisions of the PVOC program that are kind of duplicating what the PPB process is also undergoing for specific medical devices, then we are open to look at it. And of course, we'll be addressing it because, as you indicated, Kenya, I think in Africa, we are, I don't want to rate ourselves, but we are among the countries that are really serious about GRP and implementation of the WTO TBT agreement, and the TF agreement, and any other regional laws that are meant to facilitate trade.
That's great.
Yes, I don't know whether I've answered this. I don't know whether it's satisfactory or there's still follow-up questions on that.
And that subject alone merits its own webinar. There's a number of different aspects there. So thank you for fielding that. We know that topic comes up, and we're fairly certain that broad and deep implementation of GRP and TBT could provide some coherence to that element. So thank you for fielding it. And I would just note, I'm pretty sure we can take this offline, but I'm pretty sure the USMCA agreement refers to the IMDRF definition, the international definition of medical device. So I don't believe that would be the source of the challenge, but very happy to have a follow-up and side conversation in that regard. And just looking at the clock, and we're almost
maybe just to say why I mentioned it. I just wanted to bring to your attention that the definitions by the US, probably by Canada, Mexico, and Kenya could be different. So probably I think if we look at it in that perspective, that's why I mentioned those three definitions. And most likely we could be, as Kenya, I'm not very sure, but I know our PPB as a definition, that could be the point of divergence. When you say medical devices in the US, what do you mean? And when you say medical devices in Kenya, what is the scope? You see, for us, even the gloves, the hand gloves are covered as medical devices. And those are within the scope of KEBS. But there are the machineries, the hospital equipment, those are not within our scope. So we've even specified what falls under KEBS and what falls under PPB. So if you are bringing hand gloves, the surgical blades, even the protective devices, for lack of a better word, let me say the what you call it, let me just call it a spade, a big spoon, the condoms, those are medical devices. And that's called fall under the purview of KEBS and not necessarily PPB. So it could be an element of definition that now makes the feeling that KEBS also does PVOC also process registration of medical devices, and PPB is also doing. So I think that's where probably some clarifications need to come out very clearly, so that even those who are exporting to Kenya, they know. Because sometimes GRP is all about transparency. And when you are not transparent and you have a measure, you see, we have non-tariff measures. So TBT is a non-tariff measure. But when does it become an NTB? It's when the issues of transparency are not observed. So if you already know what is required of you from PPB point of view and KEBS, I don't think it will be an issue.
I think you're right that the guiding star here can be international reference documents, and I'm very happy to have a side conversation on this. But at least for the United States, the reference is the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum definition of international standard, and that's embodied within the various trade agreements, including the USMCA. I know we're kind of at the end of this panel, and I want to provide just a couple of closing remarks. So maybe Renee, any final reflections from you, and then Tobias, any final from you, and then we'll close up the session and today's webinar.
No, I think, go ahead, Stephen. I think best to wrap it up. I think we.
Tobias,
I think your last, your last wrap up was good.
I
Yes,
just want
please.
to say that we should have started doing this long time ago, but for me, it's never late to have this kind of engagement. And probably, I'm sure it will go beyond the talking, probably some trainings, because I know in Africa, GRP and even implementation of TBT provisions is an issue. Maybe probably not because they don't want, maybe because they don't know, they lack the capacity, how to go about it. So for me, I think it's a very good thing. You should go and maybe also have it physical. I really want to see some of our colleagues. So for me, I applaud the organizers of this kind of engagement, and would like to move it to the next level, so that even some of the challenges that we are also facing as Kenya, we can get assistance to sort them out. And if our business community are happy, as the government, we are very much happy, because our role here is to facilitate trade. And if there is trade, there will be taxes. And if there's taxes, my wallet will be full. So that's what I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. And maybe just my final remarks closing out the session and closing out today's webinar, in that we've been working with this medical device regulatory convergence project, and we're in a really, this event today and tomorrow will launch in a very significant way the Africa work streams that are going to be very intense over the next 6 to 12 months. And we thought it was important to have this initial session where we cover the fundamentals, the relevant international benchmark documents and references that and common vocabulary that will frame the subsequent training sessions, including tomorrow, where we take a closer look at the WHO and IMDRF specific references for medical device regulatory frameworks and regulations and standards and reliance models. We've been working in this project to both look at specific medtech bottlenecks during COVID-19 and addressing both technical and procedural aspects, and to better prepare, strengthen health systems and to better prepare for the next health emergency. And one of the diagnoses has been regulatory non-alignments, that some cases become technical barriers to trade and supply chain bottlenecks that can be resolved through broader, deeper implementation of foundational good regulatory practices and the TBT agreement. In the preparation for this session today, we had initially scheduled to have the conversation with Kenya and Ghana and South Africa, and our colleagues in Ghana and South Africa preferred to extend their comments in subsequent sessions that we may schedule. And I think, as we saw, there was enough to begin with, just beginning with the Kenya experience and broadening into the other economic regions and the continent. So we look forward to having a follow-up session where we can get the views from the KEBS counterparts in South Africa and Ghana, particularly on what we call the Tier 1 foundational GRP level. But tomorrow, our attention will focus, as I mentioned, to the health benchmarks. So with no further ado, I wish to thank everyone, all the presenters and speakers, for their comments. And I'll pass it back to Sandra for any closing remarks. Sandra?
Maybe just a small one, Vibes.
Sure.
I've turned on my camera. There are some colleagues who are really want to see this Tobias. Now they can see me. Are you able to see me?
Yes, glad to see you.
Yeah, I've used my phone. So there I am. I'm still in the office.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining in the conversation. Sandra.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And really, thank you very much to our speakers and panelists. I think this has been really, really a very rich conversation. And as perfectly acknowledged, still way to go as to get other countries joining this conversation. And before closing, I'd really like to also thank particularly the attendance of Dimakatso Mathibe, the lead of the medical devices area at SAHPRA. So thank you very much for having joined the session, and look forward to see you all tomorrow to continue, as Stephen mentioned, with a more in-depth conversation on international standards and in the scope within the good regulatory practices. So Dimakatso, please, I'm sorry, I just saw your hand raised. So Dimakatso, if you may have some comments for us, we'd really love to listen from you.
No, I apologize. I wanted to do a thumbs up. I apologize, Sandra. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, now you can voice them. That is even better. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And please let us know. I mean, you have our contact information. So if there are additional topics that you would like for us to focus on, or if there are specific questions that you might want to share with the speakers today, please send us an email and we will do our best to get back to you with the responses. And may we all continue to increase our knowledge in these areas, always thinking that as much as we learn about this, as much as we can contribute to produce much more aligned regulatory frameworks, as much as we help in order for reliance to become a reality at a global level, the closer we will be for us to meet, I think, a reason to be in here, a reason to work in the area that we are, which is in benefit of the patients at a global level. So thank you very much and see you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.